What's up, boxing fans? Greg Rowe Show Boxing. In today's video, I want to get into making the video that I made years ago called The Truth About the Misconceptions of Mike Tyson. And what I mean by that is breaking down all the myths, breaking down all the misinformation and all the BS out there about who Mike Tyson was, what his prime was, the loss around Douglas, how he would have fared against, Holyfield and Foreman pre-prison, and getting into all of those details and things that I have seen in the past that I believe are misconceptions and not truths about him, his career, his fighting style, his mental toughness, and who he really was. So Mike Tyson is one of the most controversial and well-known, most talked about figures in the history of boxing. Really, next to Muhammad Ali, he's probably the second most talked about, the second most popular, second most well-known and beloved fighter in the history of boxing of all time. Right? It just is what it is. He's a cultural icon. He's a crossover guy. He's somebody who's reinvented himself multiple times throughout multiple generations, which is extremely hard to do, especially for a fighter. It's really, really hard to do. Muhammad Ali with his humanitarian stuff was able to do that. George Foreman has been able to do that successfully with being a commentator and being a salesman, the George Foreman grill. Floyd Mayweather sort of has stayed relevant with doing other business ventures and things like that. But it's really, really hard for fighters to do. Roy Jones was in like The Matrix Reloaded. Antonio Tarver was in Rocky Balboa. So some guys have had some success out of the ring, away from the ring, but having that sustainability throughout, decades of being a crossover star, it might be Mike Tyson and that's it. So, wanted to get into, discussing his career, discussing the misconceptions that I feel are out there about him. A lot of these things come from Teddy Atlas. Teddy Atlas is a Tyson hater. He obviously trained Tyson as an amateur early in his career, and there was some kind of falling out with a family member or something where he felt Tyson was a little too aggressive with this female family member, and therefore he said he held a gun to his head, and ever since then has not liked him. Years ago, he tried to make up with him on an ESPN broadcast. That seemed to be the case, and then Teddy said the next day Tyson asked to meet him in the lobby of a hotel to talk, and Teddy said he screwed that whole thing up by, instead of just talking to him and asking if they could, continue talking and developing that relationship again, he asked him to come to his event as like a speaker or whatever, as a celebrity, and Tyson felt that he was being used and looked at that as being disrespectful, and therefore that kind of just floundered away as quickly as they sort of made up. So Teddy Atlas has come out in the past and said, the one thing that Tyson lacked was character and mental toughness, and he would fold under pressure and all this kind of stuff, and that's why he wouldn't take him to beat fighters like Ali or Foreman or Holyfield ever and stuff like that. So getting into breaking down that misconception of Tyson not being mentally tough, most people point to the Evander Holyfield fight, the second fight in which Tyson bit him, as him looking to get out of the fight because he knew he couldn't beat him and he wasn't mentally tough. First off, if you're scared of someone and you feel like you can't beat them and you're worried about them, you don't ask for a rematch, right? You don't ask for a rematch. Tyson asked for that fight. He wanted the rematch. He wanted the chance to prove he was the better fighter than Holyfield. So he asked for the fight. Typically, if you're scared of someone and you get in there one time with them, you're like, I don't want any more of that. You don't ask for the rematch, right? So right there, that doesn't make any sense to me. That fight, to me, I felt like Tyson just took it too early. I felt like that fight was a little rushed. And you can say, well, Tyson won 2 titles, coming into that fight, and in the eyes of most media members, or, hype-wise, was the favorite. If you're really new boxing at that time, Tyson had only fought 6 total rounds in 4 years. So Holyfield had been active. So to pick a guy who had only fought 6 total rounds over a guy who'd been active, to me, I went into that fight not thinking that it was going to be an easy fight and that Tyson was going to win that fight. I thought that was a 50-50 fight to me at that time, and it proved to be fight of the year, right? It proved to live up to the hype. So to me, Tyson, not being mentally tough or being scared of Holyfield, or, didn't want to fight Holyfield because Holyfield wasn't intimidated of him, just doesn't make sense to me, because he asked for the rematch. So that's one misconception right there, that he wasn't mentally tough, that if somebody pushed back or things weren't going his way, that he couldn't beat a guy, or he couldn't dig down deep, or he couldn't win a fight. Again, total bullshit. I mean, you look at, he blew Trevor Berbick out. He fought Tony Tucker, who was a bit, 6'4", 230-pound boxer with a great jab. I mean, he was a great fighter. People don't talk about him like he was a great fighter because of how his career ended. But up to the point in which he fought Tyson, he was a really, really good heavyweight. A big guy, very skilled, great jab, fast hands, really good movement, hard to really catch cleanly with punches. And in that fight, that Tyson realized probably about the 4th or 5th round that this fight wasn't going to go the way of a knockout. So he had to switch up his game plan. He had to go to plan B, and that was to outbox and outjab Tony Tucker down the stretch of the fight, which he did. So he didn't, if it wasn't going his way of a knockout, he wasn't getting frustrated, he wasn't whatever. He just dug down deep, knew what he had to do to win the fight, and he went out and did it. Same thing with the Bone Crusher Smith fight. Bone Crusher Smith was talking all this trash about how it was going to be a barn burner and he was going to go after Tyson and, he was going to really take the fight to him. And all he did was throw one punch and clinch, right? And so Tyson had to fight him the way that he had to fight him in order to beat him. Again, things not going his way doesn't mean he's frustrated and trying to get out of a fight. You look at the Donovan Razor Ruddock fights, right, in 1991. Those were tough fights. That was a big, scary dude. That was a 6'3", 230-pound heavyweight who could punch, who was very, very strong. And there were a lot of trainers, managers, promoters at that time that were more scared or afraid or didn't want to put their fighter in with Razor Ruddock than there were guys that wanted to put their fighter in with Holyfield. That's just a fact. If you watched boxing around that time and you watched shows and you read boxing magazines, that's the way that it was. That was the truth. Now, you're trying to tell me in either of those fights that Donovan Razor Ruddock didn't test Tyson, that he didn't push him, that there weren't moments in those fights that, maybe a lesser fighter, that doubt would have creeped into their mind that, I'm getting hit, this guy's big, my punches aren't just taking him out, with one clean shot like I'm used to doing. He dug down in those fights. He did what he had to do. He stopped him in the first fight. The second fight, he didn't stop him, but he swole his jaw up like this big, broke his jaw, just beat the absolute dog shit out of him. And those were tough fights. Those were fights where he had to dig down deep. He had to show some intestinal fortitude, some championship pedigree, some heart that people say he lacked in order to win those fights. And did he do that in those fights? Yes, he absolutely did. Look at his fights that he lost, the Buster Douglas fight. Now, again, you're going to have fans and critics alike that say, he was awful in that fight. You're going to have fans and critics that say, look, that was a blip on the radar. That's not really who Tyson was. He didn't take the fight seriously and he paid the ultimate price for it. If you watch the first half of that fight, Douglas was boxing him, trying to snap out a jab and put combinations together on him, and wasn't able to really do it the first half of the fight. The second half of the fight is when Tyson, not training, really showed up, right? His feet got slower, he stopped moving his head, and that's when Douglas was able to really start hitting him more and finding him cleanly and eventually stopping him. The first half of the fight, he really wasn't. But even in that fight, when Tyson knew, hey, this fight isn't going like my previous, 38, 39 fights or whatever, he didn't look to get out of the fight. He stood in there and still tried to win the fight. I mean, that's evident by him knocking Douglas down in the 8th round and then coming out for the 9th and the 10th. right? And even in that fight when Douglas knocked him down, Tyson didn't end the fight on his back. Like, he didn't end the fight like just, okay, I've been knocked down, I've been, I'm out, I'm done. He still tried to grab his mouthpiece and was counted out on his feet, right? So if you don't have heart and you're trying to get out of fights and you're not mentally tough, why are you staying in a fight that's that tough, getting knocked down, and then getting up? I don't understand where that comes from. Same thing with the Holyfield fight, the first Holyfield fight. Tyson didn't look to get out of that fight when things got tough, did he? No. That fight was stopped while Tyson was on his feet. You go to the Lennox Lewis fight when Tyson was way past his prime as far as skill level goes. Maybe the same age as Lennox Lewis, but Lennox Lewis is more in his prime as far as skills go. Like, prime isn't necessarily age. Prime is, prime of your skill set, of when you still are who you are. And at that point, Lennox Lewis was more who Lennox Lewis was than Mike Tyson was who Mike Tyson was. And in that fight, that was a tough fight. He took an ass whooping in that fight. Was there one point in that fight where he looked to get out of the fight? No. He took his ass whooping. He got knocked down and he got back up, right? He did not end that fight counted out on his back. He got up just like he did in the Douglas fight and just like he did in the Holyfield fight. So again, where are these misconceptions that Tyson wasn't mentally tough, that he didn't have heart, that he didn't have courage, he didn't have intestinal fortitude or championship pedigree come from? I mean, you can't point to the fights. If your example of that out of 58 fights is one fight where he bit a guy who had been headbutting him, and he said after the fight, I was so sick and tired of getting headbutted that at that point I didn't care about winning the fight. All I wanted to do was inflict as much damage or pain on him as I physically could, and he turned it into a street fight. That's your example, not the Douglas fight, not the Ruddock fights, not the Tony Tucker fight or the Bone Crusher Smith fight, or the first Holyfield fight or the Lennox Lewis fight. That's your example of him lacking courage, of him not having intestinal fortitude, of him not being mentally tough. It's all bullshit. It's not true. It's not true. Getting into talking about how Tyson, Tyson was supposed to fight Holyfield in 91. Obviously, he went to jail. That did not happen. And then later fought him in 96. Now, we can argue this all you want. You can say I'm lying all you want. But I'm going to give you things you can look up, as I always do, because I want you to do your own research. Go look up Evan Field's steroids or Evan Field's steroid scandal. Okay, Evander Holyfield had steroids sent to his house to the name Evan Fields, which is short for Evander Holyfield. The UPS driver that dropped off this package said that Evander Holyfield came to the door and signed for the package. So he had been taking illegal steroids. Who knows for how long, but he was not a natural heavyweight. When he came into the heavyweight division, he was like a 203 to 205 pound heavyweight. He was not a big heavyweight. He was good enough and tough enough to beat an out of shape Buster Douglas, who didn't train for the fight and was just there for a payday. But I don't believe he was good enough or big enough or strong enough to beat the giants and the great heavyweights of the 90s, Tyson, Foreman, Bo, Lewis, without taking performance-enhancing drugs, because he needed that extra strength to be able to compete with guys. I mean, all you have to do is look at when he fought Buster Douglas, and then look at how he looked when he fought Bo and Lewis and Holyfield. Big traps, just much bigger guy, skin so tight it looked like it was going to tear. His hair started falling out. He had all those heart problems. That was all from steroid abuse. So when Tyson fought Holyfield in 96, Holyfield had been juicing for years, was active, and Tyson had fought a total of 6 rounds in 4 years. So the rust was evident. The rust was evident, and it still went 10 rounds. So to me, had Tyson fought Holyfield in 91, he beats him. And in my opinion, stops him. Might not knock him out cold, might stop him on his feet or whatever, sort of how he did with Ruddock in 91. But it comes down to skill set. It comes down to the skill set. And Tyson, before the Douglas fight and Tyson after the Douglas fight, had superior footwork, superior foot speed, superior hand speed, superior defense and head movement, superior jab. superior punching power with both hands. His combination punches, the way he would change angles and slip to the side and throw, combinations that we hadn't seen heavyweights throw, and his championship pedigree. How many championship and big fights he had been into to that point were more than Holyfield. I just don't see a 205, 208-pound Holyfield who struggled with Burt Cooper and who struggled with Larry Holmes 4 years after Mike Tyson destroyed him, beating the guy who beat the dog shit out of Razor Ruddock twice. I just don't see it. So all these people that say Holyfield had his number, he would always beat him, I don't agree with that. One blip on the radar of Tyson not training against Buster Douglas does not mean that was who Tyson was. Tyson was who he was before that and who he showed he was after that. And so I would pick Tyson to beat, if not stop, Holyfield in 91 had they fought. And I think that's very realistic and very accurate based upon the skill sets, based upon how they would match up with their styles, and based upon big fight experience, based upon who Tyson was fighting and beating and how he was beating him at the time, and the guys that Holyfield was fighting and how he was beating them or struggling with them at the time. I just feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about Mike Tyson out there, that he never fought anybody that was good. He never beat anybody that was good. There's a different standard for Mike Tyson than there are for other guys. It's just a fact, right? Guys like Trevor Berbick gave Larry Holmes trouble. Guys like Carl Williams gave Larry Holmes trouble. A guy like Alex Stewart, who Tyson knocked down 3 times and out in less than 2 minutes, beat the absolute dog shit out of George Foreman, swole his whole face up, and lost a controversial decision. Michael Spinks, Larry Holmes, Tony Tucker was a great fighter at that time, a great fighter. Tyrell Biggs was a great fighter at that time. Bone Crusher Smith, Pinklin Thomas, former heavyweight champions. Razor Ruddock was a great fighter, a monster. And people talk about these guys like they were nobodies, they were bums, and he just went through and beat a bum of the month club. That was not the case. It was not the truth. If you go back at the time, I'm not talking about what hindsight is now and what we know about how those guys' careers finished. I'm talking about at the time in which Tyson fought them, they were great fighters. They were really good fighters. They were guys who were looked at as legitimate heavyweights, legitimate heavyweight champions. And just because Tyson beat them in such devastating, easy fashion or was able to derail their careers, and guys who maybe have been on a career trajectory like this sort of hit Tyson and went like this, or maybe went like this, does not mean they were not good fighters. Like if you ruin guys' careers or you destroy guys and they're never the same again, or you derail them from what people thought they could be, you should get credit for that. That should be praised. He should get credit and be praised for that, as opposed to people looking at it now and saying he fought nobody, he fought bums, he fought whatever, because that just simply was not the case. These guys were 6'2 to 6'5", 220 to 240-pound monsters. Had you put Tony Tucker, Berbick, Pinklin Thomas, Carl Williams, Holmes, Spinks, these type of guys in the 70s, you're trying to tell me that they couldn't compete with or beat guys like Corey or Bugner or Lyle or Shavers or Leon Spinks or Foreman or guys like that they couldn't at least be in these fights or had a chance to be top 5 or top 10 heavyweights or even heavyweight champions at that time, or even in the 90s? I mean, they could have. But Tyson destroyed them, ruined their careers, derailed what could have been, and instead of being praised for it by ignorant fight fans, they choose the opposite and say he fought nobody. Right? If, like, Holyfield being in fights with guys that are good fights and close fights, and that maybe he struggles with a little bit, he gets praised for those, and they're like, oh my God, that guy was so tough. But if Tyson fights him and blows him out, they're like, he was a bum. There's this double standard there, a misconception about what is truly reality that absolutely drives me insane, right? If Ali was in a fight with a guy that he struggled with, that guy was almost, elevated. His status in it was elevated in boxing. And instead of it being like, oh, well, George Foreman destroyed him, whatever, it's Ali struggled with him, so that guy was a great fighter. And there's all these different caveats in boxing based upon who you were, who you fought, what era, that just don't make sense. Like, we have to have things at an even playing field. We have to have things even to make sense. And if we can't do that, then it's just garbage. And that's what I mean about the misconceptions. Everything I just said in the last 20 minutes are all things you can look up, all things you can watch, all things you can read about, all things that you can see with your own eyeballs, hear with your own ears. And if there's anything I just said in the last 20 minutes that is wrong or inaccurate, please tell me in this comment section below. Point to where I got it wrong. Point to where I lied. Point to where I made it up. And if you can't do that, it's a misconception. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, share the video. Let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. I really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. I have more videos like this coming about, fantasy fights and, certain fighters and current fights. So if you like that kind of thing, do me a favor and please subscribe. And until next one, I'm out of here.